Argentina is an interesting case. You see, at the end of the 19th century, it was the richest country on the planet. That is, it was richer than the United States, Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom, even when it was at the peak of the British Empire. By the middle of the 20th century, the country had already gone down a few positions, but it still remained one of the 10 richest and most prosperous countries in the world. Today, however, it's not even in the top 60. So how can a country suffer such a dramatic decline? Well, it might have something to do with the fact that since, roughly speaking, the 1940s, Argentina has known only two political movements: military and Peronism. In a previous video here on VisualPolitik, we talked about the origins of Peronism. We saw how Juan Domingo Peron came to power, what his political approach was, and how in 1955 he was overthrown by a new coup d'etat. So the big question is, well, what happened after this coup? What happened to Argentina, and how did Peronism evolve? And perhaps most importantly, what does it mean? What is Peronism today? Well, listen up. In 1955, there were two coups d'etats against Juan Domingo Perón's government. In the first, which proved unsuccessful, the Argentine Navy bombarded the Plaza de Mayo in an attempt to end the president's life.
Los transeúntes fueron sorprendidos por la presencia de aviones que, según la versión oficial, volarían para rendir homenaje al Libertador.
The second, just a few months later, in September of 1955, it did not fail.
Millares y millares de voces reclaman la presencia del general Lonardi y los altos jefes en los balcones de la Casa de Gobierno. Incontenible es la emoción cuando aparecen ante el pueblo.
Peron had to go into exile, first in Venezuela, then in Panama, and finally in Francisco Franco's Spain. When the new government arrived proclaiming the Liberating Revolution, Peronism was literally outlawed. Everything, absolutely everything that had to do with the Peronist image, the marches, the symbols, the hymns, the names, everything was prohibited by the military government.
No hay vencidos ni vencedores, solamente un pueblo que marcha hacia sus legítimas tradiciones.
In just 2 years, this liberating revolution dismantled every Peronist structure before having new elections. They even changed the constitution again to re-establish the one from 1853, although they did introduce 14 articles which introduced almost all the social and interventionist measures that Peron had established. But the truth is that history is hard to forget. By forbidding everything that had to do with Peronism, in a way, the military government turned him into a kind of myth. The fact is that in the following democratic elections in 1958, President Arturo Frondizi was elected, a politician who tried to turn Argentina around and reopen it to the world, which is precisely what made the country one of the richest in the world. But hold on a moment, because despite the good economic results, he had to face the Peronist unions and the military, who had of course already gotten used to playing with Argentina however they wished. Because, well, once the military boot is used, it's very hard to suppress the temptation to use it again and again. The fact is that a few years later, the military demanded the resignation of the democratic president Frondizi. And, well, why did they do this? Well, simply because they felt like it. I mean, it's pretty much reason enough. And when the president didn't accept this, well, what do you think the Argentine military did? Well, yes, you probably guessed right. They used weapons to depose and then imprison him. The fact is that little by little the atmosphere became increasingly tense, and Peronists themselves were mobilizing more and more, demanding Peron's return. There were elections and a very fragile government. What was the result of this? The military made another coup d'etat, although this time they gave it a rather poetic name. In this case, they called it the Argentine Revolution, led by the guy you're seeing here, that's General Juan Carlos Onganía.
Yo, Juan Carlos Onganía, juro por Dios nuestro Señor y estos santos evangelios desempeñar con lealtad y patriotismo el cargo de presidente de la nación.
And this was the beginning of a very tense period, because in addition to the dictatorship, the Cold War was going on, and in Latin America that generally meant struggles between leftist guerrillas and military governments. And Argentina, they were no exception. I think we can say that the 1960s, 70s, and 80s were terrible, terrible years for pretty much all of Latin America. In the following years, guerrilla and terrorist groups began to emerge throughout Argentina, such as the Montoneros, the Revolutionary People's Army, and the People's Armed Forces. And check this out, because Peron himself had taken a strategic turn to the left and was now encouraging these types of movements, all from his home in Madrid, which of course was located in Puerto de Hierro, one of the most expensive areas of the Spanish capital. The fact is that between the bad economic situation and the attacks, there was such a huge amount of discontent that the military regime was forced to call for elections in March of 1973. Although they, of course, left Peron out under the excuse that he didn't live in Argentina. But, dear viewer, that ultimately didn't matter. In September of 1973, new elections were held, and this time Juan Domingo Peron was elected president, with, check this out, his wife, Isabel Martinez de Peron, as vice president. It was simply easier that way. Everything stayed in the family. The president-vice president tandem won them an overwhelming victory with approximately 60% of the votes. But hold on a moment, because it wouldn't be that easy. Listen up.
The return.
One thing needs to be clear. There is an unwritten law in politics. Opposition is one thing and government a very different one. And that law certainly applied to Juan Domingo Peron. See, as we mentioned before, during his time in exile, he became a point of reference for every opponent of the dictatorship, both on the left and on the right. But of course, this friendship between the extremes, once the dictatorship fell, was doomed to fall not long after. And that, dear viewer, is precisely what happened, and in a very violent way. The situation got out of hand. The leftist guerrilla groups continued to attack civilians, politicians, businessmen, as well as the military. Peron was no longer enough. They wanted a popular revolution. Well, at least that's what they called it. And the Peronist government responded by promoting the creation, listen to this, of a paramilitary group known as the AAA, Anti-Communist Argentinian Association. The result of all of this mix was tension, fear, confrontations, and disappearances. And if that wasn't enough, the economy also went from bad to much worse. So Peron's return, it was becoming a bit of a mess, and it didn't last very long, because on July the 1st, 1974, Juan Domingo Peron's days, they came to an end, and he left behind a terrible legacy. In 1975, the war between Peronists under a Peronist government was at its peak, and the economic crisis led to a brutal devaluation that left the peso in tatters. With this panorama, you can probably imagine what followed: a new coup d'etat, and it was not just by anyone. The darkest period in Argentine history began on March the 24th, 1976. The military junta government rose to power, led by Jorge Rafael Videla, whose period leading Argentina was characterized by the permanent violation of individual rights.
El cierre definitivo de un ciclo histórico y la apertura de uno nuevo, cuya característica fundamental estará dada por la tarea de reorganizar la nación.
The military junta left behind terrible numbers. More than 10,000 disappeared, and thousands more became political prisoners. But give you just a moment here, because if you think Peronism was dead at this time, well, you're very, very wrong.
A new rise.
After the dark and terrible period of the military junta, democracy returned to Argentina in 1983.
Compatriotas, iniciamos todos hoy una etapa nueva de la Argentina.
At that time, the Peronists were dismantled and a new president was elected, Raúl Alfonsín, who the Argentines most remember for the hyperinflation that occurred under his rule.
Muchos años de dictadura en el país impidieron que quizás tomáramos la lección de lo que es gobernar en la Argentina. Yo les pido disculpas a todos por mis equivocaciones, pero tengan la seguridad que hay una pasión argentina que me mueve.
Inflation soared to over 80% per month, which is pretty much what happens when you just run the money printing machine. And on top of that, both the military again and the Peronist unions decided to make this government inoperable. The strikes were absolutely endless. So, once they were reorganized, you know what? The Peronists returned, this time under the leadership of Carlos Saúl Menem. And surprise! The new president, after 2 terrible first years, took a 180-degree turn and launched policies that were completely unexpected for a Peronist government. He brought a wave of privatizations, liberalized the economy and trade, and even achieved monetary stability by introducing the 1-to-1 peso-US dollar exchange rate. Foreign investments began to arrive, trade grew, and the Argentines were again prospering and feeling like they could rise up in the world again. But, my friends, President Menem did not do one thing, and President Macri take note here because he did not reduce public spending. On the contrary, public spending absolutely skyrocketed, and so did corruption and waste of all varieties. And what's more, since things were going smoothly, the reforms, they weren't completed, leaving Argentina with an overvalued currency, a huge public expenditure, many imports, and a ton of debt. And you can probably guess what happened. In 1999, the opposition took over, but it was too late. The crisis peaked in 2001, Argentina defaulted, and the Argentines suffered the famous Corralito. Under this situation, in 2003, you guessed it, Peronists returned to power. The Peronists' ability to wriggle out of the line of fault and blame others is actually pretty admirable. They've almost always been in government, but apparently they've never been to blame for anything. And do you know who came to power here? Yes, it would be the Kirchners, Peronists who had the same policies as always, only this time very much more inclined to the left. During their years in the Casa Rosada, the Argentine White House, they restricted imports, multiplied public spending, inflation, taxes, and debt. But, dear viewer, just a moment, because before we finish the video today, we have one last question, and it's a really important one.
What's Peronism?
So what is Peronism? How has it managed to be almost hegemonic in Argentina despite the fact that it's had terrible results? These are the truly important questions. Well, dear viewer, I think that taking history into account, we can say that Peronism, more than a political party, is a movement with 2 essential pillars: excessive interventionism and public spending.
El peronismo siempre vino a reparar la injusticia, a devolver la dignidad.
The secret of their political success has to do with this. Every time Argentina has a problem, the Peronists promised more and more public spending, all of course financed with the populist politicians' favorite instrument, the bill printing machine. Under the excuse of political sovereignty, economic independence, and social justice, the 3 bases established by Juan Domingo Peron, Peronists have ended up making Argentina a country that is closed to the world, that has long-term monstrous inflation, and practically lives in permanent crisis. So the question really becomes, isn't it perhaps time to find another way? So now it's your turn. From 1 to 5, what is your degree of confidence in Argentina's future? You can leave your answer in the comments below as well as in this survey, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for brand new videos. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at Reconsider Media. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine, and as always, thank you for watching.